The elderly man strode purposefully into the Vimborne police station, his polished shoes clicking on the worn linoleum. Sergeant Jenkins looked up from the clutter on his desk, taking in the man's crisp white shirt, knife-edge creased trousers, and perfectly coiffed silver hair. "Can I help you, sir?" Jenkins asked, his mind already cycling through the usual complaints: lost cars, locked doors, errant footballs terrorizing gardens. His hand rummaged for a pen amidst the detritus. The man cleared his throat. "I've come to report a murder." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. Jenkins froze, the elusive pen forgotten. Murder? In sleepy Vimborne? His mind blanked in confusion. "A murder, sir?" he repeated dumbly. The man's pale blue eyes flashed with impatience. "Perhaps I should clarify. I've murdered my wife. I believe it's customary to arrest me at this juncture." Jenkins fumbled for a response. "Yes, well, let's just start with a few particulars. Is there someone more competent I could speak with?" The man interrupted, his tone pure ice. "My wife is lying dead in the Crown Hotel and you want my date of birth? I think not." Chastened, Jenkins gestured to a deliberately uncomfortable wooden chair. "If you'll just have a seat, I'll see if Detective Inspector Harper is available." But the man was already gone, the station door swinging shut behind him. Through the window, Jenkins watched in disbelief as a silver Audi peeled out of the car park. "Bugger," Jenkins muttered. "Guess we won't be bothering D.I. Harper after all. Our chief suspect has scarpered." WPC Atkinson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You'd better pray he's just some nutter and not an actual murderer. Letting a suspect waltz out the front door won't look good on your record." Jenkins bristled at her tone. Damn these aggressive modern women. Thank God for his sweet June, who never spoke a harsh word. Imagine being shackled to a harpy like Atkinson. It was nearly enough to make a man consider murder. The phone's shrill ring interrupted his dark thoughts. "Vimborne Police, Sergeant Jenkins. You need to send someone over here immediately," a tense voice said. "One of our maids found a body in room 3. The woman is dead. The guest, I mean, not the maid." Training took over. Grabbing a pen, Jenkins took down the details: Crown Hotel. Deceased was a Mrs. Lillian Driver. Checked in last night with her husband, who has since disappeared driving a silver Audi. He instructed the manager not to touch anything and assured him officers would be there shortly. D.I. Harper chose that moment to amble through the door, a greasy paper sack in hand. "Who wants a donut?" Jenkins filled him in on the situation, somehow making his ineptitude sound like proactive police work. Harper took it in stride. "Okay, get Atkinson over there to secure the scene. Jenkins, you go with her. I'll set up roadblocks and put out a bolo on that Audi." Minutes later, Jenkins found himself trailing Atkinson into the Crown Hotel, notepad in hand as she took charge. The manager wrung his hands, moaning about bad publicity as he led them to the room. Mrs. Driver lay atop the bed, looking for all the world like she was taking a mid-afternoon nap in her perfectly coordinated tweed ensemble. No blood, no signs of struggle. If not for her unnatural stillness, she could have been waiting for tea. Atkinson's mobile rang and her face hardened as she listened. "They've got the husband." Full confession. Apparently she was leaving him for a younger man and he couldn't handle it. Jenkins tried to imagine the prim matron on the bed embroiled in a sordid May-December affair and failed. As they exited through the posh lobby, neither officer noticed the well-dressed man in the wingback chair, a younger doppelganger of Mr. Driver, right down to the polished shoes, a small, satisfied smile playing about his lips as he watched them go. John Driver sat ramrod straight in the unforgiving metal chair of the interrogation room, hands folded neatly on the scarred table. He looked out of place in his crisp, expensive suit amongst the dingy trappings of the police station. Detective Inspector Harper scrutinized him from across the table, searching for cracks in the facade. But the old man gazed back calmly, blue eyes clear and direct. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Harper said, opening his notebook. "It's quite simple, really," John began, his cultured voice quiet in the close room. "I killed my wife." Harper watched him closely, And why would you do that, Mr. Driver? By all accounts, you had a long, happy marriage. A shadow crossed John's face. A flicker of emotion quickly tamped down. Appearances can be deceiving, Inspector. Lillian had taken a lover, a man half my age. She was planning to leave me, to abandon the life we'd built over 40 years together. For what? A fantasy she should have outgrown decades ago. He took a steadying breath, straightening his already impeccable posture. I'm an old-fashioned man. I couldn't abide the humiliation, the pity in people's eyes. If she wanted to throw away everything we had, I was determined it would be on my terms, not hers. So you killed her. Harper's voice was neutral, non-judgmental. I did. There was no hesitation, no equivocation. How? I spiked her morning tea with a sedative, then smothered her with a pillow once she was unconscious. Harper made a note, keeping his own counsel. And then you came to the station to confess. Why? John smiled thinly. Because I'm not a hypocrite, Inspector. I've transgressed against the law and I'm prepared to accept the consequences. Better a clean execution than the living death of Very tidy. Harper closed his notebook with a snap and stood. You've certainly made our job easier with such a neat confession. I'll have the constable process you through to the cells. John inclined his head in acknowledgement, unruffled. Of course, and thank you for your professionalism, Inspector. It's refreshing to deal with a man of integrity. Harper paused at the door, meeting John's gaze. Oh, we're not done yet, Mr. Driver. Not by a long shot. We'll be verifying every detail of your confession, your wife's lover, her plans to leave, all of it. Because in my experience, John smiled, a shark smile, all teeth and no warmth. I'm sure you'll do your job to the utmost of your abilities, as I've done mine. 40 years. Harper's eyes narrowed, but he merely nodded as he exited the room. The clang of the door closing behind him an unceremonious punctuation to the charged exchange. Alone, John relaxed fractionally, allowing himself a small sigh. It was done. Lillian was gone and his dignity preserved. All that remained was to endure the tedious formalities of the legal system. He had no illusions that prison would be easy for a man of his age and status. But it was infinitely preferable to the pitying whispers and sidelong glances that would have dogged his steps had Lillian succeeded in making a fool of him. This way, he was master of his own ending. And when the time came to take that last walk to the gallows, he would do so with his head high, his silver hair neatly combed. His shoes shined to a mirror gloss, every inch the gentleman, even in ignominy. Across town, in a posh suite at the Crown Hotel, Michael Lombard paced with lithe, cat-like grace, his handsome face set in pensive lines. Lillian was late returning from her assignation with the soon-to-be ex-Mr. Driver, and it was making him restless. Not that he feared for her safety. Quite the opposite, in fact. John Driver was so archetypal English reserve, he probably considered raised voices the height of violence. No, what Michael feared was Lillian getting cold feet, deciding that divorce and social stigma were too high a price to pay for her autumn romance. He stopped in front of the gilt-edged mirror, studying his reflection critically. At 42, he was in his prime, tall and leanly muscular from his years on the tennis circuit, silver just beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples. His looks and charm had always been his fortune, allowing him to navigate the upper echelon. Catching the eye of Lillian Driver had been laughably simple. The quintessential bored society wife, ripe for male attention and flattery. He'd laid it on thick, playing the smitten boy toy to her experienced woman of the world. The sex had been adequate, no fireworks, but she'd been suitably grateful for his technique. More importantly, she'd started hinting about leaving John, about building a new life together unencumbered by stuffy spouses and outdated notions of propriety. Which suited Michael down to the ground, as long as one replaced building a life together with financing his lifestyle with a chunk of her ample divorce settlement. Lillian was soft in all the ways that mattered: soft body, soft heart, soft head. Managing her would be child's play once he had his hooks firmly set. He glanced at his watch again, annoyed. Damn the woman. How long could one conversation possibly take? Perhaps he should go down to the lobby for a nightcap while he waited. Smile at the pretty concierge, Eliza. A sharp rap sounded at the door and he turned, an affectionate smile already curving his lips, ready to playfully scold Lillian for her tardiness. Mr. Michael Lombard? The female officer, a severe strawberry blonde with shrewd green eyes, held up her. Instantly, his mask of charm clicked into place. Yes, that's me. What can I do for you, Constable? Detective Sergeant Atkinson, she corrected crisply. This is my colleague, Detective Constable Davies. May we come in? We have some questions about your relationship with Lillian Driver. Of course, of course. He stepped back, allowing them to enter, his mind racing. Why would the police be asking about Lillian? Sure, is Lillian all right? He asked, pitching his voice to just the right note of concern as he shut the door. Has something happened? Atkinson and Davies exchanged an unreadable look. Mr. Lombard, Atkinson said carefully, I'm afraid Mrs. Driver was found dead earlier this afternoon. We have her husband in custody. For a long moment, Michael simply stared, his usually agile mind struggling to process her words. Lillian, dead? Murdered by John? It seemed ludicrous, like something out of a tawdry crime novel. He collapsed onto the sofa, not entirely feigning his shock. Dead? But I just saw her a few hours ago. You were aware of Mrs. Driver's intention to divorce her husband? Davies chimed in, pen poised over his notebook. Michael ran a distracted hand through his hair. Yes, of course. We've been close. And how did Mr. Driver take the news of your relationship? Atkinson's gaze was sharp, penetrating. I don't know that he knew specifically about me. Lillian wanted to break it to him gently. Let him down easy, you know? He shook his head helplessly. I can't believe John would do something. He looked up at the officers, eyes wide and tragically wounded. We were going to build a life together, Lillian and I. She was my soul. Atkinson's face softened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained brisk and professional. When did you last see Mrs. Driver? Michael closed his eyes, as if overcome. She left around 10:30 this morning. She was going back to their room to pack a bag, then confront John. He looked at his watch as if only now noticing the time. That was over 3 hours ago. I was starting to wonder what was keeping her. If only I'd known. His voice cracked artfully and he buried his face in his hands, shoulders heaving with silent sobs. The officers retreated We'll be in touch, Mr. Lombard, Atkinson said as they left. Please don't leave town until we've concluded our investigation. Of course, Michael mumbled through his hands. Anything I can do to help. I want justice for my darling Lily. The door snicked shut and he waited, holding his pose of grief until their footsteps had faded. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his head. His eyes. Lillian was dead and her money out of reach. John Driver had seen to that with his fit of husbandly pique. All Michael's careful maneuvering, wasted. He sat back on the sofa, jaw clenched as cold fury simmered in his gut. He'd already been forming vague plans for Lillian's tragic demise. A car accident perhaps, or a fall down a flight of stairs after one too many lunchtime sherries. Nothing definite, just ideas to tuck away in case she became more trouble. Trust bloody John Driver to bollocks it all up with his gentlemanly revenge. The pathetic old fool had probably been too squeamish for anything but a kindly smothering. No doubt Lillian had expired tidily between her 300 thread count sheets without so much as a hair out of place. A fitting end for the boring old biddy. He tamped down his irritation and forced himself to think rationally. Lillian was gone and John would hang for his crime. While it was a disappointing end to a promising scheme, it wasn't an insurmountable setback. He was already nestled in the bosom of Bournemouth's genteel society. This was merely a temporary inconvenience, nothing more. He was Michael Lombard and he always landed on his feet. Within the week, he'd have a new prospect on the line, a new fortune to charm his way into, and this time he'd make damn sure the husband was too cheered by the prospect. He rose smoothly to his feet and crossed to the sideboard to pour himself a celebratory snifter of Lillian's excellent brandy. As the rich, smoky liquor slid down his throat, he lifted the glass in a mocking toast to his erstwhile lover. "Goodbye, my dear Lillian," he murmured, cold eyes glinting in the fading afternoon light. "I'd say you'll be missed, but we both know that would be a lie. You were a sweet diversion, nothing more. But don't fret. I'll be sure to chuckling at his own dark wit. He drained the glass and set it down with a decisive clink. Somewhere in this hotel, an attractive, neglected woman was waiting for a man just like him to enter her life. It would be rude to keep her. Whistling a jaunty tune, he collected his jacket and room key and headed for the door. A new name already forming on his smiling lips. Eliza or Emma or whatever her name was, wouldn't know what hit her. The game was afoot once more. Detective Inspector Harper sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger as if to physically stave off the headache building behind his eyes. The Driver case should have been open and shut. A jealous husband, a dead wife, and a confession tidy as a Christmas bough. But his first stop had been the Crown Hotel to speak to the staff and guests, try to build a picture of the Drivers in the days leading up to the murder. But instead of the grieving, shell-shocked widower he'd expected, he'd found the rooms stripped bare of any trace of the couple, as if they'd never been there at all. "Checked out first thing this morning," the manager told him, all obsequious smiles now. The gentleman? Harper latched onto the odd phrasing. "You mean Mr. Driver?" The manager blinked, then frowned. "No, the other gentleman. The young man who was..." Harper's headache spiked and he ground his teeth against it. "Michael Lombard, you mean?" "Yes, that's the one." The manager snapped his fingers. Charming fellow, very smooth. He settled up the bill and had the porters clear everything out. Even left a generous tip for the maids to deal with the... Alarm bells clanged in Harper's head. Lombard had been playing the part of the bereaved lover, not six. Something was definitely off. But he needed more than a gut feeling to upend the case at this stage. "Any chance your staff noticed anything unusual about the Drivers during their stay?" he asked, not holding out much hope. The manager pursed his lips, thinking, "Well, now that you mention it." Harper's ears pricked. Did she say who Mrs. Driver was arguing with? No, just that it was an older gent in a dark suit. She assumed it was an older man, so not the boy toy, Lombard. Interesting. I don't suppose there's any CCTV coverage of that area? Harper asked without much optimism. The manager actually looked offended. Certainly not. We pride ourselves on our discretion here, which was probably why a silver-tongued snake like Lombard had chosen it for his dirty weekend hideaway. Of course, Harper said soothingly. Well, thanks for your time. If you or your staff think of anything else, give me a call. He handed over his card and beat a quick retreat, mind-churning. An unknown older man arguing with Lillian Driver the day before her death. Lombard's suspiciously efficient tidying of loose ends. The pieces were there, but the shape of them eluded him, slipping away like wisps of fog. He needed more information, a wedge to crack this case open and let some light in on all its dark corners. Climbing into his car, he drummed his fingers on the wheel, considering his next move. Mrs. Driver was well known in the Bournemouth social scene. Perhaps it was time to ask some delicate questions in not-so-delicate places. See what rumors were swirling, and he'd start with the tennis club. If Lombard had met Lillian anywhere, chances were it was on the well-manicured lawns and exclusive lounges where the genteel set went to see and be seen. A little subtle pressure on Lillian's so-called friends, and he might shake some. Decided, he turned the key and guided the car out into the twilight, the first tendrils of a plan taking shape. One way or another, he'd get to the bottom of this. John Driver's fate, Sylvia Mountford, Lillian Driver's oldest and dearest frenemy, was everything Harper expected her to be: refined, elegant, and utterly ruthless beneath a paper-thin veneer of gentility. She greeted him in the sunny parlor of her sprawling estate, not a hair out of place despite the early hour. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were cold. "Detective Inspector," she cooed, gesturing him to a seat. "What an unexpected pleasure. I assume this is about poor Lillian's untimely demise." Harper inclined his head as he sat, noting the lack of genuine grief in her voice. "It is. I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on the situation, as one of her closest confidants." Sylvia preened slightly at that, settling herself regally on the divan. Can you think of any reason why he might have done it? Any trouble in the marriage?" Her smile sharpened, a gleam of malicious glee sparking in her eyes. "Well, one hates to speak ill of the—" Harper leaned forward, feigning avid interest. "Indiscreet? You mean she was having an affair?" Sylvia waved a languid hand. "Oh, any idea who the other man might have been?" She paused, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against her chin as if deep in thought. Now that you mention it, she had been— Michael Lombard, yes. We've spoken to him. He claims he and Mrs. Driver were in love, planning to build a life together. Sylvia threw back her head and laughed, a throaty, mocking sound. "Oh, I'm sure he did. That man could charm the knickers off a nun. He had Lillian wrapped around his little finger." Harper nodded, unsurprised. Lombard had oozed insincerity from every pore. but he sensed Sylvia was holding something back, some juicy bit of gossip she was dying to let slip. "You know, it's funny," he said slowly, watching her closely. "The hotel manager mentioned seeing Mrs. Driver arguing with an older gentleman the day before the murder, but we haven't been able to identify him. I don't suppose you have any idea?" Sylvia's eyes flashed with triumph and she leaned in conspiratorially. "I didn't want to say anything, but, well..." Harper's heart quickened. Now they were getting somewhere. "And you think Mrs. Driver was arguing with this Crispin? About what?" She spread her hands magnanimously. "I couldn't possibly speculate, but I do know Lillian had helped him out of a few tight spots financially over the years, and he has a terrible temper. Flying off the fit, it all fit. The mysterious older man, the financial motive, the history of volatility. Crispin Driver was beginning to look like a far more compelling suspect." He stood abruptly, mind racing ahead. "Thank you, Mrs. Mountford. You've been extremely helpful. I may have a few more questions for you later, if you don't mind." "But of course." Sylvia smiled up at him, saccharine sweet. "Anything for dear Lillian. I do hope you get to the bottom of this dreadful business. Let me know if there's anything else I can do." Harper mumbled a vague assurance and hurried out, already digging for his mobile. He needed to get a background check going on Crispin Driver, pin down his whereabouts. For the first time since this whole sordid affair began, he felt a spark of real excitement. The thrill of the chase, the scent of the truth. He gunned the engine and roared off down the neat, tree-lined lane, a fierce grin tugging at his lips. The game, as they said, was on. Crispin Driver sprawled in the hard metal chair of the interview room, looking far too insouciant for a man facing a murder inquiry. His suit, while well-cut, had the slightly shabby look of good clothes worn a season too long without a trip to the tailor. His hair... "So, Inspector," he drawled, examining his nails with exaggerated nonchalance. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this little tete-a-tete?" Harper leaned back in his own chair, cool and assessing. "Why don't you tell me, Mr. Driver? Where were you on the day Lillian Driver was..." Crispin smirked. "Where was I? Oh, here and there. You know how it is. A gentleman never knows where the day might take him." "Cut the crap." Harper's voice was sharp, unyielding. "You were seen arguing with Mrs. Driver at the Crown Hotel the day before she died. What was that about?" For the first time, a flicker of unease showed in Crispin's eyes before being quickly masked. "Arguing? Nonsense. Lily and I were thick as thieves. I popped round for a cozy chat. That's all." Harper leaned forward, pinning him with a steely gaze. "See, I don't think that's true. I think you were putting the squeeze on her for money. Again. Only this time she'd had enough. She was cutting you off, wasn't she? Cutting off the flow of cash." Anger flared in Crispin's face, bright and vicious, before he got himself under control. "I don't know what you're implying, Inspector, but I'd be very careful about throwing around baseless accusations." "I'm sure you do," Harper said evenly. "But are they the kind of friends who'll stand by you when you're accused of murder? Because that's what this is, Mr. Driver. Murder. And right now, all signs point to you." He ticked off the points on his fingers, his voice implacable. "Motive. You were bleeding Mrs. Driver dry and she was finally cutting you off. Opportunity. You were at the hotel that day, and no one can account for your whereabouts at the time of the murder." Crispin was silent for a long moment, a muscle jumping in his clenched jaw. When he spoke, his voice was low and furious. "You're reaching, Inspector, grasping at straws. You've got nothing Harper smiled thinly. "Not yet, but I will. And when I do, I'll take great pleasure in personally escorting you to the gallows." A fitting Crispin shot to his feet, chair clattering to the floor. "I want a solicitor. I'm not saying another word until I have legal representation." "Of course." Harper rose as well, unruffled. "Take all the time you need, but know that—" He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving Crispin seething impotently behind him. Out in the corridor, he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He'd rattled Crispin, that much was clear. The man was guilty as sin, he could feel it in his bones. But he wasn't there yet. He needed hard evidence, something to definitively place Crispin at the scene at the time of the murder. Something ironclad to crack John Driver's dogged insistence on taking the fall himself. Because that was the final piece that didn't fit John's unwavering confession in the face of mounting evidence against his brother. Was it some misguided sense of, or was there more to it? Some deeper, darker secret the Driver brothers were desperate to keep buried, even at the cost of John's life? Harper didn't know, but he was damn well going to find out. He had a feeling if he could just get John and Crispin in a room together, get them talking, the whole rotten edifice would come tumbling down. But first, he needed that evidence. Crispin had slipped up, mentioning friends in high places. Harper would bet his pension those friends were the kind who might be persuaded to distance themselves from a murder suspect. It was time to rattle a few gilded cages, see what unsavory secrets shook loose. Crispin Driver's days of coasting on charm and family connections were about to come to an abrupt end. Jaw set with determination, Harper strode towards the exit. He had calls to make, favors to call in. The noose was tightening around Crispin Driver's neck. It was just a matter of time now, and Harper had nothing but time and tenacity, even if he had to bring the whole damn upper crust of Bournemouth crashing down to do it. In a dimly lit back room of a shabby Bournemouth pub, a secret meeting was taking place. 3 men huddled around a battered wooden table, smoke from their cigarettes curling in the stale air. Michael Lombard looked ill at ease in the dingy surroundings, his usual polished facade marred by a day's growth of beard and an increasingly frank. And between them, an uninvited guest, Detective Inspector Harper, his face impassive but his eyes alight with a predatory gleam. "Gentlemen," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "how good of you to join me. I thought it was time we all had—" Crispin's lip curled in a sneer. "I have nothing to say to you, Inspector, and I don't appreciate being summoned like a common criminal." "Oh, but you are a common criminal, Mr. Driver," Harper said calmly. "A murderer, to be precise. And your charming friend, Mr. Lombard here, is your accomplice." Michael started as if slapped, his head swiveling between Harper and Crispin. "What? No. I had nothing to do with Lillian's death. I loved her." Crispin snorted derisively. "Oh, please. You loved her money, you mean? You're a con artist and a cad, Lombard. You wouldn't know real love if it bit you on the arse." "You're one to talk," Michael snarled, color high in his cheeks. "Bleeding poor Lillian dry for years with your sob stories and your schemes. You're nothing but a leech." "Enough!" Harper's voice cracked through the rising argument like a whip. "You're both guilty as sin, and I can prove it. The only question is, which one of you is going—" The 2 men fell silent, glaring at each other with undisguised hatred. Harper let the moment stretch, the tension ratcheting higher with each passing second. Finally, Michael licked his lips nervously and spoke. "I didn't kill her. I swear it. Lillian was my golden ticket, my way into the life I always wanted. I'd never jeopardize that." "But you knew she was going to cut Crispin off, didn't you?" Harper pressed. Michael paled but said nothing. Harper turned his attention to Crispin. "And you couldn't let that happen, could you? Couldn't bear the thought of having to stand on your own 2 feet for once. So you decide." Crispin's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "You can't prove any of this," he ground out through gritted teeth. Harper smiled thinly. "Can't I? I have hotel staff who will testify to your argument with Lillian. I have your financial records." The color drained from Crispin's face and Michael made a choked sound of dismay. Harper leaned forward, his gaze boring into them. "Here's what I think happened. You two cooked up this scheme together. Lombard would seduce Lillian, get her to agree to a divorce and pay out a hefty settlement. Crispin, you'd inherit the bulk of the driver fortune once John was out of the way. A tidy little plot, I'll give you that. But Lillian was smarter than you gave her credit for. She caught on to your games and threatened to cut you both off without a penny. So you panicked. Crispin, you lured her to the hotel to try one last attempt to Silence fell thick and heavy. Michael's shoulders slumped in defeat, all the manic energy draining out of him. But Crispin remained defiant, his face a mask of cold fury. "And if all this is true," he hissed venomously, "what makes you think I won't do the same to you? A tragic accident for the dogged inspector who got too close to the truth. It would be so easy." Harper actually laughed at that, a short, harsh bark. "Oh, by all means try. Give me an excuse to..." He stared Crispin down, unflinching, until the other man finally dropped his gaze, all the fight going out of him. "But I don't think it will come to that," Harper continued calmly, "because here's what's going to happen. You're both going to come with me and give full confessions, here and now." Michael was nodding frantically, desperate tears leaking from his eyes. But Crispin still hesitated, a last flicker of "And if we refuse?" he asked hoarsely. "If we take our chances with a jury of our peers and the skillful tongues of our barristers?" Harper's smile was cold and pitiless. "Then I'll make it my life's mission to see you hang, to watch you kick and twitch at the end of a noose while your brother rots in a beat, too." Then Crispin slumped back in his chair. "Where do I sign?" he asked dully, and Harper knew he had one. The trial was a media circus. The lurid details splashed across the front page of every newspaper from Brighton to Blackpool. The tale of passion, greed, and murder amongst the upper crust was simply too tantalizing to ignore. Michael Lombard cut a tragic figure in the dock, still clinging to his persona of the bereaved lover even as the prosecution ripped his story to shreds. He wept and protested his innocence right up until the moment the judge passed down his sentence life, with a chance of parole in 20 years. Crispin Driver, by contrast, showed no remorse. his face a mask of stone as his sordid history was laid out for all to see. Gambling debts, questionable financial dealings, a string of scorned lovers. No squalid stone was left unturned. When the judge declared life, and John Driver, the unwitting patsy, watched it all from the gallery with haunted eyes, a man broken by the betrayal of those he held most dear. When Harper met his gaze, he saw not condemnation, but "He'll never forgive himself," the inspector murmured to Constable Atkins as they left the courthouse. Waiting, Atkins shook her head sadly. "There's nothing you could have done, sir. Some people are just born rotten." Harper grunted, unconvinced. He knew he'd be seeing John Driver's hollow gaze in his dreams for a long while to come. But even as the accolades poured in, the congratulations on a job well done, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Some niggling detail he'd over. It wasn't until late that night, nursing a scotch in his dimly lit office, that it hit him. He sat up straight, the glass tumbling forgotten from his fingers. Lillian Driver had known. She'd caught on to Crispin and Michael's schemes and been ready to cut them off, yes. But what if she'd gone a step further? What if she'd put measures in place, a failsafe should the worst happen? With a sense of rising excitement, Harper began mentally reviewing the case file, the inventory of Lillian's effects. There had been a small key on a chain around her neck, a key that matched no lock they'd found. At the time, first thing in the morning, he'd have Atkins get him a warrant for the Driver and Lombard residences. He'd tear the places apart brick by brick if he had to. If Lillian Driver had left an insurance policy, he'd bloody well find it. And if his hunch was right, if there was more to this case than met the eye, then God help Crispin Driver and Lillian Driver deserved no less. And Harper always got his man one way or another. The scotch sat ignored as he reached for the phone, his blood singing with the thrill of the hunt once more. Sleep could wait. Justice, it seemed, was not quite done with the Driver case after all. The garden was a riot of color, the heavy scent of late summer roses hanging in the still air. Bees droned lazily from blossom to blossom, fat and drowsy in the afternoon heat. And kneeling among the flowers, a trowel in one earth-stained hand, was a woman. Her hair was gray and curling, her face lined with the passage of years, but her eyes sparkled with life and her smile was quick and bright. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, an old melody from days gone by. The years had been kind to her, all things considered. A new name, a new life far from the scandals and shadows of Bournemouth. She'd made a good life here, a quiet life, the kind of life Lillian Driver had always dreamed of, before her world had turned to ash and betrayal. She paused in her digging, sitting back on her heels with a contented sigh. She'd saved herself in the end, through cunning and foresight and sheer bloody-minded will. She'd led them all a merry dance, the greedy fools. Let them think her dead and gone, a convenient scapegoat for their sins. She'd had the last laugh in the end. Her smile turned sly, secretive. Only one other soul knew the truth, the one man she trusted to keep her secrets. Dear John, who'd played his part to perfection, the grieving husband, the noble sacrifice. He'd joined her in her new life. Lillian looked up as a shadow fell across her, squinting into the sun. John stood over. "Lost in thought, my love?" he asked gently, brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her smile broadening. "Just counting my blessings. And to think, I almost lost it all to those two vipers." John's face darkened for a moment, then cleared. A near thing, but you were always too clever for them. For any of us, really? She laughed at that, linking her arm through his as they began to walk back to the house. I merely played the game by my own rules. They underestimated me. A fatal mistake. One they'll have a long time to contemplate, rotting in their cells. John agreed grimly. Though I still don't know how you convinced Harper to let it go, to not come after you once he'd figured it out. Lillian's smile was pure mischief. Oh, Harper is a smart man. John shook his head wonderingly. You're a marvel, Lil. Truly. She squeezed his arm affectionately. We both are, darling. Knights in slightly tarnished armor, to the very end. They shared a conspiratorial grin as they stepped into the cool dimness of the house. The ghosts of their pasts left to whisper and fade in the bright summer sun. The driver case was closed, the file stamped and sealed. But for Lillian and John, it would always be a secret triumph, a victory snatched from the very jaws of defeat, a reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys could win, even if their methods were slight. And as for Harper, well, perhaps it was time for a long overdue holiday.